Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very, very touched with the beautiful song that was presented on Ganesha and Samskara Foundation. I think you are doing tremendously wonderful work. You're reaching out to students. You are talking about Indian history, and in India also you have done amazing work. I hope the COVID situation clears up quickly so that you can get back to what you were doing in India as well. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Sahana ji.
Okay. So, welcome everybody to my talk. Thank you so much for the lovely songs that you presented. So, my presentation will last for about an hour, but if you want me to shorten it, just send me a message on the chat, and then do you have a restriction, time restriction
The
for this?
time was for 1 hour for the talk and then
Okay,
interaction, Sahana ji.
okay. So I'll try to keep it to 1 hour. Uh, So this is the book that I have written recently, a few years ago. It's called The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste. It's available on Amazon. And this is the topic, whatever I'm talking to you today, it's all in the book and it has a lot of references. So if you want to know where I got the data from, you will see that in the bibliography in this book. Oops, 1 minute. So I want to take you to a time when India was the educational capital of the world. It was a time when students came from Western Asia, China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Lanka. So whichever part of the world was civilized and which was interested in educating its students, from those parts of the world, the students came to study in India because they knew that India was where the best colleges were situated. So it is similar to how today there is a rush to get degrees in America from the Ivy League universities in America, or people go at students try to get admission in Oxford, Cambridge, in the UK, Australia. So something like that was happening in ancient times, but it was India. The whole world wanted to come and study in India. And these students, they made dangerous journeys in order to reach India because it was not easy to travel in those times. So they could not just get into a flight. So they had to make very long journeys, which would take months together. When they would come by sea, they would walk. Then they would also use animals, the carts, bullock carts, whatever means of travel was available, they would use and they would come. But many students, when they came from abroad, they were put into very dangerous situations. In there, sometimes the ships would get wrecked, but they had their goal clear in mind that they must somehow reach whichever university they had planned to join and get through the difficult admission tests. Because even after they managed to land up in a good Indian university, it was their seat was not guaranteed because the admission tests were very hard. For example, in Nalanda University, only 20% of the students who applied would get selected. So the focus on merit led to highly original work in art, logic, grammar, mathematics, engineering, and sciences, especially medicine, chemistry, physics, metallurgy, navigation, and more. Practically in every subject, India was the leading center of education. Whether it came to theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge, everything, India had the finest ecosystem of learning. Learning was a sacred duty. So here is a ceremony that some of you might be familiar with. It is called Vidyarambha. So when children first time when they learned how to write alphabets, that was a sacred ceremony. All over India it was celebrated, and I think today it is only common in southern India. I don't see it being done in northern India all that much. Uh, and so there were many other ceremonies. Every milestone of education was done in a very ceremonial way. And the whole approach to education was that it's a very holy, very sacred activity. And when you do it, it's like you are getting closer to God, to the Paramatman, when you embark on knowledge, gaining knowledge or sharing knowledge. In those times, there were forest universities. There were, like here in this picture, you can see that there is a guru sitting under a tree and teaching students. So like that, it was very common in India, in ancient India, that, it was like, you could call it a university because these gurukulas were situated very close to each other. and they taught, sometimes one guru would be teaching one discipline, one subject. He would be an expert in one subject. And after the students learned from him for many years, they would be sent by the guru to another guru close by in an ashrama nearby. And then there they would learn a higher subject or a different subject. So many times these, you could actually say that these were different departments of a university, except that they were all in the open. So it was not like the university that you see nowadays in buildings. It was all in the open. So in the Mahabharata, there's a mention of a forest university which was headed by Rishi Kanva. And Rishi Kanva was in charge of all those departments, those different departments which were headed by different gurus in the forest. I just wanted to give you some idea about the scientific statements that are found in many shastras. You know, when you pick up the shastras and read, you'll find that there's a scientific basis to everything that is being said. For example, you see in the Nyaya Sutras, there's a statement that says, truth exists whether or not we humans acknowledge it. So this is the kind of scientific statement that is valid even today. It doesn't feel ancient at all. But imagine this was being taught even thousands of years ago in India. Then there is another, this is an excerpt from Sushruta Samhita, which is the oldest medical text which is available today. And it says, a physician who has learned one science only cannot be sure of his own science. And for this reason, the physician has to be versed in many sciences. So look at this. There is this book which is saying that don't confine yourself to just one subject. Try and read and learn and explore other subjects as well, because that will make you understand your own subject. So these are the kind of statements and concepts that you will find throughout our Indian Shastras. In this map of India, I have tried to plot the famous universities of India. And, I found that almost every part of India was covered with universities, and even the white spaces where you don't see anything, I still have to plot more, because more are being excavated even as we talk. So if you see in the eastern part of India, there were a cluster of universities. So this is where Nalanda, Vikramshila, Jagadala, Somapura, these were all clustered over here. This covered Bengal, Bihar, Bangladesh, Odisha, all this came over here. Varanasi is also over there, a little away from it. And then if you saw in the northern part of India, there was Takshashila. Takshashila is the oldest university which has been excavated. It goes further than 6th century BC, older than that. And there is Sharda Peeth, which was in Kashmir. I'll tell you more about it later. Purushapura, which is today called Peshawar, it's Pakistan. Takshashila is also located in today's Pakistan. Western part of India, you can see Vallabhi, and this is where students went to study administration, governance, economics. This was famous for that. And then in the southern part of India, you see Kanchipuram and many other universities, and also smaller centers of learning. Not all were huge universities, some were smaller centers which took lesser number of students. Then in the extreme south, you see Kantalur Shala in Kerala, that was called the Nalanda of the South. It was a very famous university which had even more subjects than Nalanda. Most people have only heard of Nalanda, right? But there were many other universities. In fact, near Nalanda today, there is an excavation going on, and I'll show you pictures of that in the next slide. And also remember that students were traveling to all over India, wherever they wanted, whichever university they wanted to join, they were prepared to travel to it and appear for the admission test. Just like from outside India, also students were coming. Within India also, there was a lot of travel in order to get educated in the subject of one's choice. The teachers also would travel. The teachers would sometimes set up a new university. They would graduate, a student who would graduate from a university and study for a few years would set up a new university in another part of India. That was quite common. Here is a picture of Takshashila, which I mentioned earlier, which is the oldest Indian university excavated. It's all in ruins now. It's in Pakistan. And these are the ruins of Nalanda University, which is in Bihar. If you get a chance to travel, you must visit this. It is a huge, it is located on a very huge area. And they have only dug up about 1/10 of the expanse of the university. And if you read the descriptions of this university written by the students who studied here, they have described that it was full of beautiful lakes, gardens, trees, fruit-bearing trees, medicinal trees. And the Chinese travel Xuanzang has talked about the view from the third or fourth story of the main building, from where he could see all those lilies blooming in the lakes. And he said that he had never seen anything this beautiful in China. And mind you, this university, it was funded by 100 villages. So the revenues from 100 villages which were around Nalanda were funding this university. So they were taking care of all the expenses of the students and the teachers. So I mentioned to you that excavations are still going on. So this is the Telhara University, which is being excavated since 2009, and it is located very close to Nalanda University. It's almost as big as Nalanda. So the society, the Indian society, supported learning. It was a society where everybody knew that his or her duty was to support students and teachers. The teacher was the most respected person in society. And so financially, emotionally, personally, in every possible way, the people supported scholars. During religious ceremonies, donations were given to teachers and educational institutions. It was considered very noble and very meritorious when somebody donated to teachers. And education could be funded as an act of commemoration of a departed relative. So if somebody's son died in a war, then the parents would set up a scholarship in his name. That kind of thing also happened even in those times. Chairs were set up in universities. The kings were very aware that they needed to support learning. So they would gift lands to gurus. So when a guru became very well known and was known to, his students were, were very, made a name for themselves, then the king would look out for those gurus and donate land to them so that they could build centers of education. There are many inscriptions you can find all over southern India which talk about how much land has been given to the gurus in order to spread education. So in this way, the seekers of knowledge were freed from the burden of earning a livelihood. The ecosystem was such that the teachers did not have to worry about where their food will come from. The students also did not have to worry, because wherever they went, if they went at lunchtime and knocked at a door, then the people would offer lunch. So in this way, they didn't really have to worry about having a job. So they could focus totally on learning. The society was like that. And it's because of this that we were so ahead of the rest of the world in every subject, because people were wholeheartedly engaging in education. The ethos of the times demanded that Brahmin scholars led simple lives and engaged in pursuit of knowledge without amassing riches. So the culture was such that the Brahmins were those who studied or who taught, and they were supposed to be very simple. They were not supposed to acquire wealth and be wearing gold necklaces and looking very and living luxurious lives. They had to be very simple, because all their energies were to be directed to learning and teaching. So it fell upon the shoulders of wealthy non-Brahmin families and farmers to support those who devoted their entire lives to learning and teaching. The expenses were subsidized by ruling kings. I mentioned already about Nalanda. The revenues of 100 villages were used to fund them. The students and teachers received clothes, food, bedding, and medicines free of cost. In some ashramas, the rich students paid, while the Brahmin students who were too poor to pay would opt to do menial tasks. So they would do work in lieu of paying. But the rich students would, give something. Usually at the end of the education period, they would give a dakshina. But there are accounts sometimes of fees. Like in the Jatakas, we do see that there are gurus who take some fees. But those who could not afford it, usually typically Brahmins, would not pay anything, and they would still be able to get educated. And it was perfectly all right that, you could solicit financial assistance from households. So a student could go and ask for help to pay for his education, and somebody would help him out. Now I come to the topic of debating, which was an intrinsic part of Indian education. So you would see that we have so many schools of philosophy, we have different kinds of worship. There's no rule that there's only one God. There's no such thing. You know, people are free to worship in the way they like, and there are different philosophies. All this comes from the culture of debating that we had, which was at the root of it, of our education system. So in this picture, you can see Adi Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra. This is a very famous debate that has been captured in this picture. And this went on for days. And you can see that the judge is a lady who was highly accomplished, very learned woman, and which shows to you that even women were highly educated in those times. The terminology of debate was well developed. You know, it was not that two random people would start debating on something. No, it was very well codified, and it was like a science. And so they had terms of debating, such as, you know, sadhya. Sadhya meant the thesis which is to be established. Siddhanta, which is the proposition, tenet, or conclusion to be established. Hetu, reason. Udaharana, example. Pratyaksha, perception. Anumana, inference. Pramana, proof, which is very, very important. All these terms were understood, and so it was not just that two people just started debating. There would be a judge, and there would be an audience, and also the debaters needed to be completely thorough with the opponent's point of view. So if the opponent has written books, then this debater one has to be aware of all the books written by debater two, and vice versa. So this is how they debated. And there is a scholar called Vasubandhu who developed 22 criteria for losing points in a debate. So this could be used to deduct points in a debate, right? So imagine how advanced it was. So there were points deducted for hurting the proposition, which was called pratignahani, shifting the proposition, opposing the proposition, renouncing the proposition, shifting the reason, shifting the meaning of the topic. So this was such a high level of debate that even today, maybe you will not find this standard of debating. If you see the TV debates, you'll be surprised. You'll say, if anybody is aware of the kind of standards that we had in ancient India, in today's debates will seem very low level and not informed. The centers of learning, all those universities that I showed you, they played a big role in nourishing the spirit of open debate. So this is how questions used to be asked. So they knew. And you know, many of the books are also written in question answer format, many of the Shastras. The kings were fond of organizing intellectual tournaments. The kings would love to organize debates, and the best debaters would be rewarded. Those who were able to put forward finer points in philosophy, those who were ornate in diction were rewarded. So communication skills were constantly honed. So even today, if you speak to traditional scholars, you'll find that they're excellent communicators. This comes from our ancient tradition. I must mention that temples were also centers of learning. Though the temple's main purpose was, of course, to go and worship the deity, to do aradhana and all that, to do the pujas. But then the temples also nourished education. So there would be at halls, annexes in the temples where lectures could be held, where debates could be held, classes could be held. So temples were also centers of learning. These are the ruins of the Sharda Peeth in Kashmir. I showed you the Sharda University in Kashmir in the map. And that was a very famous university. So the whole state of Kashmir was called Sharda Desh because Sharda is none other than Saraswati, the goddess of learning. So people would go and worship at the Sharda Peeth temple, but those who were scholars would go to the library and the university attached to it. So sometimes scholars would refer to the manuscripts kept in the library. There is an instance of Ramanujacharya traveling all the way from Tamil Nadu to Sharda Desh or Kashmir because he wanted to refer to the manuscripts, the original manuscripts there before he wrote his book, his commentary on Brahma Sutras. So this temple was destroyed by an Islamic king called Sikandar. I mean, not maybe directly, but maybe one of his people. So that, in fact, the whole of Kashmir was covered by temples, and today very few are left because of the successive waves of violence against the religion and the temples, Hindu religion and the temples. So this is an Agrahara. So when I showed you the map of India with all those universities in southern India, many of those were actually Agraharas. The Agraharas are colonies of teachers' houses. So when the king would give land to the teachers, then they would all build houses close to each other. And so they would be colonies. And the students could go to their houses to study. And if you see the front porch of the house, this is where the students would all be sitting and chanting or asking questions to the teacher. And this created a very vibrant atmosphere of learning because the different disciplines, the teachers who taught different disciplines were all staying close to each other. So maybe, so sometimes there would, and a spontaneous debate would take place, when right in the middle of the street or in somebody's house. And this is how so much of knowledge was generated. Here is the Ennairam temple inscription. So as I mentioned to you, there are inscriptions which show you how much education was institutionalized in India. So this Ennairam inscription is famous because it has many, many lines of writing which talks about how much of scholarship is to be given to students. And those students who are studying the more difficult subjects, they are to be given more money compared to the students who are studying the basic subjects. And it talks about the medical care to be given to the students. It talks about how much the teachers should be paid. So all this shows to you that education was very well established in India. Now I want to talk to you about the interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. So it was just not studying one subject, but also collaborating with students who were studying other subjects, right? So there was no artificial divide between religion, sciences, and other subjects in those times. The Brahmin priests needed to be well versed in mathematics. So it was not like only religion, if somebody is studying religion or practicing religion, that person doesn't know anything about science and mathematics. In fact, it was all together. So, when yagyas were held, the fire ceremonies were held, they needed to have altars. And those used to be in accurate geometrical shapes. So the priests needed to know geometry very well. And similarly, yantras were drawn at the time of Homa or Yagya. And they also required knowledge of geometry. Then the timing of the worship, the rituals, that it had to be an auspicious timing. And for this reason, the knowledge of astronomy and trigonometry was also needed. So all these priests, the scholars who were engaged in studying so-called religion or philosophy, they also had to be good mathematicians, astronomers, because all this was required. All these subjects were together. Now, you know about Galileo. Galileo was a 17th century scientist, and he was arrested after an inquisition by the Catholic Church because he said the earth went around the sun. In the 17th century, he was arrested. Whereas if you look at our culture, even in 3000 BC, our priests themselves were astronomers, right? And maths and poetry were also not separated. So if you look at the works of Bhaskaracharya, also called Bhaskara II, he was a poet mathematician. If you read his works like Leelavati, then you will find that the problems of arithmetic are composed in a poetic form. So, and also the formulae, the concepts are expressed in poetry form. Imagine how difficult it is. Can you think of expressing mathematical concepts in poetry today? So today we have separated all these subjects, but in the ancient times in India, they were all together. So they were multi-talented scholars. Now I come to the topic of how knowledge was transferred out from India to China. So you know that, of course, students came and studied in India. But apart from that, many people took manuscripts from India to their own country. And that's how knowledge grew in their countries. Thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts were carried to China from India. So Indian scholars like Kashyapa Matanga, Dharmaratna, Sanghavarma, Dharma Satya, Dharma Kala, these are all the names of scholars from India who went and settled down in China, and they helped to translate the Indian works in Sanskrit to Chinese. For example, there is a scholar from southern India called Dharmaruchi. He lived in China for 20 years and translated 53 works into Chinese in the 7th and 8th century. Then there was, the scholars were so much in demand, the Indian scholars in China were so much in demand that a scholar called Dharmakshema was being coveted by two Chinese kings. They both competed and they both wanted him in their courts. And ultimately, he was assassinated because one of them kings said that if he's not going to be in my court, he should also not be in his kingdom, and he was assassinated. Then Amogha Vajra is an Indian scholar who collected 500 texts from different parts of India and settled down in China. And in fact, for him, a palace was built by the Chinese king, and he was given a lot of respect. So the Chinese really respected India's body of knowledge. They respected scholars who came from India. They did everything to make it comfortable for them to live there and not go back to India. They also gave them Chinese names. So today, when you see the history of China, you may not know that they are referring to Indians because the names, they were given Chinese names. Now, the Indian astronomers and mathematicians from the best universities held high positions in India, in China's scientific establishments. In fact, they set up those scientific establishments. For example, Gautama Siddha, he was called Kutan Siddha in Chinese. He became president of China's official board of astronomy in the 8th century. He translated the Navagraha calendar into Chinese. He introduced Indian numerals to China. So this is how you see how Indian knowledge is getting established in China. The printing press was invented in China, but it was done by the Buddhist scholars who went from India to China. And printing was used as a means to spread Buddhist thought. This is the statue of a very famous Indian scholar, which is found in China. His name was Kumarajiva. He was the teacher of Fa Hia. It was after he taught Fa Hia that Fa Hia decided to move to China. He was one of the scholars who, early scholars who came to India. Did I say China? He moved from China to India, okay? So he translated more than 100 Sanskrit works, which became masterpieces of Chinese literature. So there is something called a Diamond Sutra, which is very popular in Buddhist literature. It was he who translated that from Sanskrit to Chinese. That was the China part of it. Now I'll talk about Western Asia and Europe. So you know that there was a thriving trade between India and Western Asia, which was not just in spices and textiles. We are taught that India and Western Asia were trading, right? What we call today Iran, Iraq, Egypt, all these countries were trading with India. But it was not just trading in products. Ultimately, they started taking medical knowledge from India, okay? Now, Pythagoras, not many people know, he traveled to India. There is a great deal of evidence to show that he traveled to India. So even the theorem that people call it as Pythagoras theorem was not his theorem. He also never said that he invented it. He learned it from Indian scholars because he spent so much time in India. Rishi Kanada is another contact. He was the person who influenced Democritus. Rishi Kanada was in the 6th century BCE in India, and Democritus was a scholar in Greece. He's called the father of modern science. But if you see the works of Democritus, they seem to be copied from the works of Rishi Kanada very clearly. And Democritus' student was Hippocrates, who is the father of Western medicine. But you see that all that medical knowledge, a lot of it has come from India, and you will find plenty of evidence of that. The Library of Alexandria, which was one of the famous libraries of ancient times, which was used by the Greeks and the Egyptians, they used to get a lot of manuscripts from India. They were known to go to any extent to buy, borrow, or steal to get the most original, most authoritative copies. So if any ship that docked in Alexandria used to be examined to get books from there, if there were any books, they would immediately be taken away to the Library of Alexandria. And then, of course, later they were translated to Greek and other languages. The first acquaintance of Arabs with scientific astronomy and Hindu numerals was through the works of Brahmagupta. This is admitted by Al-Baruni, who is a Muslim historian. So he says that when they came across the works of Brahmagupta on mathematics, they were just amazed. They had never seen anything like it. And it caused a kind of a scientific revolution in the Arab land. The Brahmagupta's work was translated by Al-Fazari. Now, Indian scholars were very, very much welcome in Baghdad. Those were the early days of Islam. And so they had something called the House of Wisdom, which was similar to the Alexandria Library. And it stood there from the 8th to the 13th century until it was destroyed by the Mongols. And so in this House of Wisdom, you could find the literature, books from manuscripts from India, which were translated into Persian or Arabic. The Indian physician Manka was invited to be in the court of the fifth Abbasid Caliph, who was the king, the Islamic king. And he lived there, Manka, who was a Brahmin physician. And he translated the Sushruta Samhita into Persian. Again, this became like a bestseller. It was very well received, the Sushruta Samhita, and then later translated into other languages. I think I repeated this point twice, sorry. The Muslim intellectuals such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Farghani, Al-Tabari, all these are famous Muslim intellectuals and scientists, right? But most of them took Indian knowledge of math, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and even music to the Islamic world. So most of them are actually translators. The translation was big business in those times. And even the House of Wisdom was actually like a translation center. Now, math was called Hindisa, means pertaining to India. The subject of mathematics itself was called Hindisa. That means it came from India. Sorry. What we call as the European Renaissance was actually propelled by the works of Arabic scholars, which were passed off as original works by Europeans. So when the Islamic lands were taken control of by the Christians, and the European Renaissance took place, that was the time they actually were just translating what they got in Persian and Arabic works. They were translating that to Latin and passing it off as their own works. There was something called the Toledo School of Translators in Spain in the 12th and 13th century. They got a lot of these Arabic manuscripts and translated them into Latin overnight. I mean, day and night they were engaged in translation. So this was one of the major translation centers. And that is how all the knowledge from India first went to the Islamic world, and from there it was translated to the European world. The Portuguese, the Dutch, French, and British, when they later came to colonize India, they collected large number of manuscripts. In fact, there is a book called Bibliotheca Malabarica, which is a catalog of over 100 Tamil manuscripts collected by one single missionary called Bartholomew Ziegenbalg during 1706 to 1708. So in those 2 years, he collected all these manuscripts and made a catalog of them. And then these were all translated. Garcia de Orta is a famous Portuguese intellectual. He is considered to be one of the big contributors to Western medicine. But he lived in Goa in India for a long time, and he had conversations with the local people, and he got a lot of books and manuscripts. He learned the local languages, and he wrote a lot of papers on medicine. But if you see, most of his knowledge came from Ayurvedic knowledge, whatever he learned about Ayurveda in India, and his work influenced later works on medicine. Now I come to a painful period in Indian history when the major universities of India were destroyed. So mindless violence was unleashed on famous universities of India from the 12th century onwards. This is a picture of Bakhtiyar Khilji when he went to destroy the Nalanda University. So a group of horsemen suddenly descended from nowhere, and they went into Nalanda University. They just started killing all the students and the teachers. They set fire to the library. And then after that, all the other universities, Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Jagaddala, Somapura, all these universities were destroyed. Can you even imagine that? Can you imagine that happening today? A university being completely destroyed with all its knowledge? So something like that happened in Indian universities in the 11th century. So there was a destruction of manuscripts, temples. It led to the flight of scholars. Temples and viharas were destroyed. Jizya was imposed by the Islamic rulers. Jizya was a tax which had to be paid by the non-Muslims. And humiliating conditions were imposed on the Hindus. And there was an emphasis on Islamic education. So all that, the knowledge, body of knowledge that had been collected over thousands of years, suddenly now all that was being destroyed. It was being in danger. Scholars started fleeing from the universities wherever the invaders were coming. They tried to flee to other parts of India where the hand of Islamic rule did not extend. So some of them escaped to Tibet. Many of the works, the manuscripts of Nalanda were carried by scholars to Tibet. Not Nalanda, Vikramshila. When Vikramshila was being set on fire, some of the scholars managed to escape carrying the manuscripts, and they went to Tibet. Nalanda was, of course, completely destroyed. And then in other places where the invaders started destroying temples, the priests and the scholars, they fled with whatever they could carry, and they went to other parts of India or even out of India, wherever they could get shelter. That was one of the worst periods of Indian history, when Arabic and Persian were imposed, and learning, all this research that was being carried out came to a halt. And there was some respite during Akbar's rule. It picked up a little bit because Akbar was a little more benign, so he allowed some Sanskrit to be taught in madrasas and allowed Hindu students to join there. But still, the vibrance, the vibrant ecosystem of learning was destroyed. At the same time, the Mughal rulers, they did not build on the leading edge scientific concepts that were presented by Hindu scholars of an earlier era. So they did not become world leaders in science and math despite ruling over the richest country, because they were not interested in it. The Sanskrit works of scientists and mathematicians of the earlier eras began to be forgotten. So people soon forgot Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya, all the famous works written by them as Islamization progressed in India. So the Mughals were more interested in poetry than science and technology. So the teaching of science and mathematics suffered. Madrasas proliferated, students became adept in the finer details of Quran and Hadiths in Muslim India. Meanwhile, the Western world was making advances in science and technology. You saw how they translated all the Indian works. So they were building up upon it and becoming leaders in science and technology. Now I come to the period of colonization, the British imperialism. Of course, the Portuguese were the first people to land in India, and they were followed by French and others, the Dutch and then the French. But ultimately, the British became the most powerful colonizers. All these other European powers were driven to the periphery of India, while the British began to rule over the biggest part of India. Initially, the British did not bother with educating the natives. They started playing politics with different rulers and enriching themselves. Then slowly they realized that they needed, if they wanted to manage a country like India, in which people were so educated, so it was important to have some centers of education, but then make sure that the knowledge which suited the British was being taught to the students. So the British set up Mohammedan and Sanskrit College in Calcutta and Banaras in order to provide regular supply of qualified Hindu and Mohammedan law officers. So when they wanted to dispense law over India, they wanted law officers. So for that, they set up these two colleges. Meanwhile, there were two camps of British. There were the Anglicists and the Orientalists. They both believed that Indians were innately inferior and needed to be educated. But the Anglicists said, let's teach English to everybody and let all knowledge be taught in English. Whereas the Orientalists said that let us take the English books and translate them to various Indian languages, and let us teach them, teach our knowledge through Indian languages. And a lot of these people were missionaries. So Christianity was driving most of these educators. The question arises, why did the British impose English on India? So the main answer, the important answer is convenience. The convenience attached to having English-speaking natives, because a large number of British officers could not understand regional languages. So they didn't want to learn Marathi or Tamil. So they said, let's make them all learn English so that we can communicate with them and we can order them, tell them what to do. Also, the sepoys, a large number of Indians were recruited into the armies. And they realized that if the sepoys, if they studied Persian or Sanskrit, then they could become disloyal, because those who studied Sanskrit would know about the great wisdom in the Sanskrit text, and they would not respect the English bosses. So they realized that by teaching them in English, that could be avoided. And they realized that familiarly acquainted with English literature, the Indian would speak of great Englishmen with the same enthusiasm as the British themselves. They would reject the teachings of Brahmin priests. In fact, all this is mentioned in the books written by the East India Company, by the officers of the East India Company, that when we make them learn English, they're going to regard English heroes as their heroes, and they would start disrespecting their own heroes. And that's how, after 15 years of debating, the English Education Act of 1835 was imposed over India, by which they decided that the medium of instruction would be in English. There would be English school, the subjects would be taught in English all over India. So there is something called the Macaulay's Minute. Macaulay was a person who wrote a big document saying that he gave all the reasons why Indians need to be taught in English. And that document is very famous. I'll show you this famous statement that he wrote in that document. Macaulay said, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." So you see the British strategy of education, right? So they wanted a class of interpreters between them and the people whom they governed. And so the education system was tailored for that. Meanwhile, when India was embroiled in the education debate, England was languishing in illiteracy. So England was not having a large number of schools or anything. Very small fraction of people in England were educated. And the only book that most illiterate people had read in England was the Bible. So compare that with India, where even thousands of years before Christ, we already had educational institutions, and we had that ecosystem of learning. So the first elementary school came up in England only in 1850. And there is a funny quote in Charles Dickens' book, Nicholas Nickleby, where he says, "The schoolmasters as a race were blockheads and impostors, ignorant, sordid, brutal men to whom few considerate men would have entrusted boarding or lodging of a horse or a dog. These schools were opened by any man who had not proved his fitness for any other occupation in life." This is in sharp contrast with what it was in India, where the best of people would become teachers. It was just the opposite in England. Now I would like to tell you about Dharampal. Dharampal is a very important person because of whom we know a lot about our education system in ancient India. Because when he went to England, he happened to find certain documents in the library, and these were actually the results of surveys conducted by the British themselves. So when the British imposed the education policy on India, before that, they wanted to know what was the status of education in India. So they carried out a very detailed survey in different parts of India, in northern India, eastern India, southern India, right? And the results of those surveys were all published and kept in the libraries, which Dharampal discovered. Now, what did Dharampal find? I've told you about the surveys that he found. He found that the survey mentioned every village in India had a Pathshala. There were 100,000 Pathshalas in Bihar and Bengal alone. This has been mentioned by Thomas Munro in the documents that Dharampal found. Reading, writing, epics, arithmetic were all taught in the schools of India. So even though the Muslims had destroyed the higher education system of India, they had not managed to destroy the grassroots level education system. So the primary schools were still functioning, even though they did not have much money to run, and the teachers did not have, they were not too well off, but still they were keeping them running. And that is how literacy was very high even in the villages of India. And the teachers were all very dedicated. There were superior methods of teaching, and attendance was very high. This was noted in the survey that the British carried out, that attendance is good. In a large number of schools, the Shudras were in majority, while the Brahmins and the Vaishyas, they were called Vaisyas by the British, they were in minority. So this completely flies in the face of what we are taught, that only the Brahmins were getting education. That was not true. The British, when they did the survey, that's not what they found. They found many Shudras in schools. In fact, in some Pathshalas, there were more Shudras than Brahmins. And you will find all these tables there in Dharampal's book. It's called The Beautiful Tree. Now, Alexander Walker was a person who worked in the East India Company, and he made all these statements when he went back to England. He said, "No people probably appreciate more justly the importance of instruction than the Hindus. They sacrifice all the feelings of wealth, family, pride, and caste that their children may have the advantage of good education." This love of learning was no exclusive characteristic of the Brahmins, but this desire is strongly impressed on the minds of all the Hindus. These are very significant statements made by Alexander Walker. I also want to tell you about the innovative teaching and examination methods which existed in India. There was one missionary called Reverend Andrew Bell. He was traveling within Tamil Nadu, and he was very impressed with the teaching methods in the rural schools in Madras Presidency. In fact, he was so impressed that he introduced it as the Madras method in England. So what he saw was that even though the people are poor, they all knew how to read and write. So he wondered how that was happening. He wondered how did the schools have blackboards and all that. But when he went, he found that the schools did not have blackboards. What they were doing is they kept a whole bulk of sand. Outside every school, there was a whole lot of sand deposited, and the students were taught to trace the alphabets on the sand. So they did, even without a blackboard, they were learning how to write letters, how to do addition, subtraction, various arithmetical problems on the sand itself. And this kind of sand was found outside all the schools. And then Andrew Bell was impressed with the monitoring system, which he had not seen before. He saw that even when the teacher was not there in the school, the older children were teaching the younger children. So he saw that the older children were sitting with the younger children, teaching them how to write letters, clarifying concepts for them. So he was so impressed that he said, I need to do the same thing in England. And he set up schools in England which followed the same concept of monitoring, where the older children would be trained to teach the younger children, and in the process they themselves would learn. And by 1821, 300,000 children were reportedly being educated under Dr. Bell's principles. It was called the Madras method, and his ideas were adopted in Europe, West Indies, even Bogota in Colombia. Then there is another missionary called Reverend Robertson, who noted a very interesting manner of competition between schools in Bardhaman in Bengal. So he noted that once a month, all the higher classes of different schools in Bengal would meet in one place, and the top student of one school would ask a question to the top student of another school. And if he was not able to answer, the question would get passed to the second student. And if he couldn't answer, it would go to the third student. And in this manner, every school was able to put questions to the students of the other school. And so Robertson noted that this was a very fun way of conducting examination. Actually, it was an exam, and the students did not even feel they were being examined, and they just enjoyed. The Brahmin students, he noted, were sitting with the Shudra students. There was no segregation, and sometimes the Shudra students were getting higher marks than the Brahmin students. If you go to Scotland, even today, you will find the Madras College, which was founded in 1833 by Reverend Bell. It is still there in Scotland. As the British rule progressed, poverty and famine became rampant because, as you know, India was governed for the benefit of Britain. Everything that India produced, food grain, textile, steel, gold, silver, everything was being diverted to Britain. As a result of that, India became very, very poor. and there was no food for teachers and students in pathshalas. So that is how the Indian education system collapsed under the British rule. So in places like Tanjavur, mass poverty was created overnight by the imposition of 59% taxation of gross produce. So the British were very efficient in taxing different parts of India. They went even to the remotest village and ensured that they paid taxes. The district collector's role was to fleece the citizens. Even temples were not spared. They had to part with their donations and they fell into disrepair, which still continues. So the British educational policies sounded the death knell for our education system, Indian education system, as well as the regional languages. Mother tongues were relegated to second languages. In fact, Mohandas Gandhi said in 1931 that the British had left India more illiterate than it was just 100 years before. 100 years before, India was more educated than after the British came and set up their English medium schools. And even today, the effect of that continues. India still has one of the highest number of illiterate people. Now, we can't blame the British for everything that went wrong, because when India became independent from the British, there was a fresh chance to decolonize, but that did not happen. I'm hoping that with the new education policy, which has been announced, some changes will come. But the main problem is that the Indians still look at themselves from alien eyes. They don't look at, they don't have the insider's view about themselves. So today, our past heritage lies buried in regional and Sanskrit literature. So if there is one message that I want to give you, it is that you must learn your native language and you must try to read the literature, because that is what is going to tell you your true history. And you would get some of the ancient knowledge back if you learn to read Sanskrit. The translations are never good enough, and translations are loaded. They are written from the perspective of the colonized people. So with this, I just want to share a quote with you, that if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree. This was said by Michael Crichton. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I didn't make you all go to sleep. If you want to contact me, this is my email address. And if you want to buy my book, it's available on Amazon. You can also find me on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. With this, I come to the end. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions, if any.
There are a bunch of questions, Sahana ji. First of all, thank you very much for very enlightening and very actually striking talk there. The comments that I'm getting from a lot of especially high schoolers is, oh, I did not know that.
Okay.
So,
I'm glad.
And there are a bunch of questions too. And these students, I must warn you, they are extremely inquisitive. Every weekend, every class that I do, I have to be prepared for googlies from them. Okay.
Okay. So then please help me out then if I'm not able to answer.
So the first question is from Sriya Katreddy, California. She asks, in the Forest University image you had in your slide, you showed both men and women, and you showed equal proportions of them learning together. Was this the real case in those Forest Universities, or was this an artistic choice?
Well, I must tell you, I already showed you a picture of the debate, right? You saw the debate between Shankara and Mandana Mishra, and I showed you the picture of a lady who was the judge. So that already gives you enough inkling that women were educated in ancient times. The Upanayana ceremony that was carried out when a child embarked into higher education, that is the ceremony which marked the entry into a Gurukula or a university, that was carried out for women also. Girls also got that, had the Upanayana ceremony. So yes, even in Mahabharata, we find mention of Gurukulas which were headed by women gurus, lady gurus. Yes, that women also were being educated, but that doesn't mean that all the girls were going into forest universities. I'm not saying that, but those who were highly interested in being educated, who were passionate about it, yes, they were doing it. They were seeking higher education. And not to forget that in the Rig Veda, which even Sarveshji will be able to tell you, there are many shlokas which are written by women scholars. There are so many women scholars who have written very important verses which are still being chanted every day by Indians. So women were absolutely part of the education system.
Thank you, Shahana ji. The next question is from Tejas Bhatia. He wants to know, you talked about the foreigners coming to India and you gave a lot of data points. When is the oldest time period when we know of the foreigners coming to India to learn?
I think you can, that what I can see is probably Pythagoras, because I see the mention of Pythagoras coming and learning from India, but it doesn't mean that it is the oldest. Because what we find mentioned is in the text is not necessarily the, it's not like we go to the oldest text and we, whatever mention we find is the absolute time when the first foreigner came to India. Because we are seeing even in 3000 BC, because trade contacts, as long as trade contacts were there between India and the rest of the world, you can assume that there were people coming and learning in India. So we cannot, though Pythagoras is one of the earliest mentions that I see, and because after that came Alexander and all the Greek contact officially we see, but because trade was already existing, I can safely say that knowledge was being was going out from India.
Thank you, Shahana ji. The next question is, what should we do that is in our control to bring back the elements of the education system that you talked about?
So I think what you should do is first come to learn about it. Like when you learn your native languages, when you read more about the ancient education system, you will yourself think of ways to incorporate that. I think I made a slide on that. Maybe I can just see if I can open that up. Okay, can I share my screen again?
Sure,
okay,
ji.
I'll just show it to you. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see.
So I have talked about ideas that we can take from the ancient education system, like the holistic nature of education. Maybe this doesn't really answer your question. So I think we can take these concepts and incorporate them today. Like, you know, I've improved memory, the spirit of inquiry, logical thinking, debating, love of learning. Maybe we can take some ideas from debating from ancient times, the logic, how logic was being taught. We can talk about the care of nature and environment, which was core to every subject. Okay, so these are some of the ideas. Environment was not taught as a separate subject in ancient India. So whatever subject you studied, whether it was chemistry, biology, any subject, environment was a part of that. That is something that we can think about. Let me stop sharing because this doesn't really totally answer the question. But I think what you can do is know more about it and then try to incorporate that into your curriculum, right? If a teacher who's aware of this would think of ways to get it into the curriculum, right? So right now, what the biggest problem is to correct the history. People are learning the wrong history about India. So once the right narrative is set, already then that's the beginning of learning taking the right knowledge from ancient India.
So Sahana ji, if I could interject my own question there to you, because it's related to what this girl asked. I think yesterday or this week, I shared with you a question from another high schooler who shared 2 pages of her history textbook that clearly paint a picture of ancient India ridden with caste, ridden with gender biases, ridden with so much inequality in the society. So if a student faces that textbook and the teacher teaching that in the classroom, what should be the right stand that the student can take? How can the student correct the narrative?
No, first of all, that the whole narrative has to be changed, because the impression being created is that the lower castes were not in the education system. That has to be changed, because we have enough evidence in our from our texts that even Aryabhatta is supposed to be a Shudra. Aryabhatta was not a Brahmin, one of the greatest mathematicians, right? I think if he was a Brahmin, his name would have been Aryabhatta, but he was Aryabhatta, which shows that he was not a Brahmin. So then we have to bust all those myths that India was divided into compartmentalized caste, and there was absolutely, it was a rigid hierarchy. There was no rigid hierarchy. A lot of all this Varna system that we had was based on the guna and the swabhava of the people. So what you would need to do before you take on any of these Western scholars is to first read those books, some good books on what India's Varna Jati system was like. And you also should know that we were one of the richest countries in the world, right? In the beginning of the millennia, we were very, very rich. We were the top economic giant, right? And so if all those things that we were manufacturing, which were for export, you think it was being done by Brahmins? Brahmins were not doing all that. All those products which were being made, the manufacture of that, it needed engineers, it needed artisans, and they were not poor. They all had the money and they were educated too. So all this myth which has come about the caste system has come from the colonial period. So we had a Varna Jati system which was not like the caste system of Europe. Europe had a caste system. So if you go back and read the history of Europe, you'll find that they had a caste system which was very rigid. It was based on racial purity, the purity of blood, which we never had. Okay. So if you read the Western Foundation of Caste System, written by a bunch of scholars, if you Google that book, maybe I can share it with Sarveshji later. That is a very good book, Western Foundation of Caste System, which explains how the caste system actually came from the West. And when the British wrote our history, they actually viewed the whole society through their lenses, and they were very familiar with the caste system in their own country. So they were looking for who is the most oppressed person here. Okay, he's the lowest caste, something like that, which was not actually the way it was in India. And the other book is Castes of the Mind. So if you read all these books and then you read about how India became an economic power because of the Varna Jati system, which these are books written by Professor Vaidyanathan, Guru Murthy, you will come to know, you'll have a totally different picture of India. So you have to equip yourself with all that knowledge before you take on the Western scholars.
Thank you, Sahanaji. I think that helps a lot. There are quite a few flurry of questions, especially from the high school batch students. I'll pick up only a couple of them. What are your thoughts, Sahanaji, on the clashes between Hindu beliefs and the new scientific discoveries that have been made more recently? A broad example would be the theory of evolution. What do you suggest that our generation carefully navigate this confusion between any Hindu beliefs that conflict with the new discoveries while still remaining respectful to both our religion and the science?
So how does Hindu belief conflict with evolution? I would like to know, because I never saw the conflict.
I think that's an example she is picking, that's all.
Okay, there is absolutely no conflict between evolution and Hindu beliefs. Hindu beliefs do not conflict with science. Okay. At the most, maybe you can talk about maybe bhakti, whether that conflicts, but I don't think that conflicts, because you can have your beliefs in, you can believe in the Paramatman, right? But when you do your scientific research, you are going to actually find out the reasons for various phenomena, and that then you can be as scientific as you want. So there is no clash. There is no Galileo who is being put under house arrest, or there's no Shankaracharya who is going to come out and say, you dare not do any scientific research, you dare not talk about evolution. Nothing like that is happening in India. So there is no clash. So I do not really understand the question, maybe. If you can point out a clash, then I'll probably address that.
So I will move forward. I think you answered it, Sahanaji. I also have not seen really a clash, but if I can, I understand the sentiment where the questioner is coming from. She wants to know that if there is, for example, a Pauranika narrative, which seems to be clashing. For example, the geography described in Puranas is co-centering circles of oceans and land, etc. Now there can be interpretations of it, but if there is some belief, it can be, I mean, Hindu belief system is so diverse that you can never really canonize it, right? So if something clash happens between a fact that is observed and a belief system, how to navigate that
So don't
difference?
forget that we had the tradition of debating. Even in ancient times, if somebody, that whatever diagram, that might have been a conceptual framework, maybe it's not a real representation. So I can imagine even in the most ancient of times, if anybody came up with a new scientific theory, there would be clashes, because they were all, even the scientists were disagreeing with each other. So if you see, Aryabhata's works were not accepted by many other mathematicians, and they used to write. The only way we used to disagree was by writing a book. So you would, if you don't agree with something, you will write your own book, and then you will have your own followers who will follow your book, and then the other followers of the other books can coexist with you. So there was never any kind of clash in that sense. It was all debating and arguing.
Okay, thank you. Multiple children have asked, so I'll pick up Neha Suresh, her question. She's asking, Neha ji, thank you for the talk. What is your comment about the current change in the education policy of India? Another student has asked, your comments on the new education policy recently announced by the government of India.
The new education policy seems to have addressed a lot of problems because they have made it more flexible. Earlier, it was more rigid. People could not combine certain subjects with other subjects. Now they can take mathematics with maybe music and all that. That has all become quite good. So I'm in general happy with the policy document, but what I'm worried about is the implementation, whether it is really going to be implemented well. And I'm also worried about who is going to write the textbooks. So the textbook committee, I want to know who is going to be in the textbook committee, and ultimately who is going to write the books. So there might be a very good policy, but the books that are being written, if they still carry some of the colonial mindset, then we are again, it's just the old problem in a new framework. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the new educational policy.
Okay. Sahana ji, there is a related question. Perhaps student is asking, you talked about Sanskrit language, education medium being the Sanskrit. What in your opinion should be in our time the role of Hindi and other Indian languages in the education system that you should have?
Well, I think that Sanskrit needs to be learned by as many people as possible, because Sanskrit is not just a language, it is a language of languages. When you learn Sanskrit, it improves your understanding of every other language. So if there is a way that Sanskrit could be taught more widely, and if everybody could learn, it will be to their advantage. Of course, I won't like it to be imposed, but I would like that understanding to mature, that everybody would benefit from learning Sanskrit. It makes you understand not only the structure of language, it makes you understand logic. When you learn Sanskrit, it makes you understand grammar, it makes you, and then it opens a whole arena for you to read books which will expand your mind. Okay. And languages, the Indian languages, they are all at par for me. So if you are able to learn any Indian language and Hindi, of course, it's a good thing. If you learn Hindi, of course, you'll be able to communicate quite easily in northern India, maybe even in southern India, because Hindi movies are so popular. So I don't see any disadvantage if Hindi is also broadly learned. But I would like to see more of the southern Indian languages also being learned by people in northern India. And similarly, I mean, I don't want the way it is right now, where a lot of, just a second, my phone is... there is this tendency for people not to learn the language of the other state that they travel to. So in Bangalore, you will see there is no attempt being made to learn Kannada. A lot of people, outsiders who have settled there, they speak in English and they don't try to learn Kannada. That should not happen. I feel that if you go to, like when I lived in Bengal, I learned Bengali. I can read, write Bengali, I can communicate in Bengali. And similarly, I want that when people live in any state in India, they learn the language of that place, because that's how you're able to help the civilization itself.
No, absolutely. In fact, if I can add, Sahanaji, that used to be the normal way for Indians to know at least four languages. Sanskrit and Hindi were, of course, accepted, given. But in addition to their mother tongue, they definitely learned so many other languages. That was a common thing, just like 50 or 70 years back, even.
Yeah, that's true.
So there are a lot of questions about caste, but if I can just summarize, perhaps Jhansi has asked a representative question, and I think you have answered it. But if you want to once again underline that, she's saying, in one of our assignments in the Samskara Foundation class, we watched a video about Chanakya, and it showed that Chandragupta Maurya and the other people of lower caste were not allowed to get educated. Do you think that is correct? And does that exist even today?
I'm not sure about that. I have not heard anything like that, that Chandragupta was not allowed to get educated. I don't know if it's historical. But one thing which was a concept that was prevalent in ancient India was the concept of adhikara. Whether you have the adhikara, it was not like a right. It was like a eligibility, whether you. So the teacher would assess whether a student has the eligibility to learn a certain subject. So if you want to learn the Vedas, okay, and if you do not have the adhikara, you are a person who is very dirty or unhygienic, or if you are not able to pronounce anything, if the guru talks to you and he sees that you're not able to pronounce anything correctly, it's likely that he'll not take you. It was a very merit-based society. So it was not like, politically correct where, you will take any, just to please a certain community. It was not like that. So in that sense, maybe it's possible that people who were born in a certain educated family would probably get into the best colleges or universities. But it was not it was not discrimination. It was not really discrimination, because we hear of many people from the lower jatis who actually became gurus themselves, right? If you go back and I can give you a whole list of gurus who were not Brahmins. Okay. So, and also because you see, it was not a watertight caste system where, if you are in this caste, you can do this. It was, nobody was monitoring it, nothing like that. So if you have a passion for something, you will go and do it and you will achieve success in that. It was like that even for women. Okay. The hurdles will be there for everybody. The women, you can't say that, women were being invited to come and educate themselves. No, a woman, of course, when she gets married, she's going to have children, then those responsibilities will be there. So how much time would she have to educate herself, right? But those who are passionate will do something, will find a way to do it. So it's like that. It's like today, the way you overcome your challenges and get what you want. It was just like that in the ancient times also.
It makes sense, Sahanaji. So middle schoolers now are getting courage to ask question. Okay. I'll pick up perhaps one question in interest of time. So Arpit Kesharwani says, in my school, they tell me that India did not create the number 0. What he means is perhaps Arabs did. And they say that Sikhism, Jainism, etc. are not world religions. When I, in the list of world religions, when I put Sikhism and Jainism, they say those are not world religions. When I tell my teacher, she tells me that I am incorrect. What should I do?
So you should tell your teacher, it's very easy to disprove the 0 part of it. If you go and find out what the Arabs said about 0, okay, they said, the Arabs said that they used to call it, the numerical system itself was called by a term which denoted that it came from India. So, so if you see that the Arab works, right, the Arab mathematics works, they all quote from India. Most of them are translations of Indian works. So if you maybe if you buy my book, you can give those references, and it is very easy to show that Arabs got the number system from India, and that's how it was called the Indian number system. So that is how you can say that 0 also must have traveled from India to Arabs, right? And the other thing about Sikhism and all, they're not world religions. So you should question, what is a world religion? Is it because on numerical, how many people follow it based on that? So if that is the way they're saying it, then maybe they're right. But then if you say that geographically, Sikhism is there in Canada, there are many Sikhs in Canada, there are Sikhs in Australia. So if you see in every country, there are Sikhs. So in that sense, it is a world religion. Okay. And you must also remember that all these are dharmic religions which have flowed out of Hinduism. Whatever religions came up, like, Buddhism and Sikhism and all, it is only in recent times that we've given those tags to them and we call them by those names. Earlier, they were not seen as separate religions. They were all seen as part of the same dharma-based religions that came from India. That also you must remember. There is an attempt being made to show that these are absolutely watertight separate religions. That's not true. Sikhism, in fact, was they were protecting the Hindus from the Islamic invaders, right? The Sikh gurus, the Sikhs were protecting. If you see from Guru Gobind Singh, he fought the Muslim invaders, and they were protecting the Hindu. They were all Hindus. They never said that they are not Hindus. They still believed in all the gods that we had. So you must also remember that Sikhism is not a separate religion in the real sense. It was made later into a separate religion. So if you are saying that Hinduism is a world religion, then all these religions which came out of Hinduism, they are also world religions then, aren't they?
Sahanaji, there are a lot of comments thanking you for the enlightening talk. A lot of people are saying that they're going to buy your book right away. A lot of children are interested in again hearing more from you. So those are a lot of comments of that nature.
Please write to me if you have any questions. Please email me. If I can, I will answer you, or I will let you know the books that you should read. So I'm very happy you are interested in this topic. Thank you very much.
So that's Sahanaji. With that, I think we can conclude.
Thank you.
So shall we do the Shanti mantra? So
please do that.
So everyone, you can now unmute yourself and please say after me. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah.
Om Sarve Bhavantu
Sarve Santu Niramaya.
Sarve Santu Niramaya.
Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu. Ma kaschid dukha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.